The confusion that reigned inside the church, especially to do with this very important issue of unity, was simply a reflection of the world at large. For a start, many of the mainstream denominations were very varied in themselves.
We saw how the Elizabethan settlement created a state church in the UK that was always compromised. The disagreements and divisions of the subsequent 400 years saw the advent of many new churches which suffered from the same old problems. The Baptist Church in the UK is a good example. The Baptist Union, which had once been Calvinistic in its doctrine, was, by the mid-20th century, a very broad church, containing fundamentalists on the one hand and liberals on the other, with everything in between.
In 1971, the principal of the Manchester Baptist College, Michael Taylor, spoke at the annual Baptist Union Assembly, ironically held at Westminster Chapel, home for so many years to the preaching and teaching of Lloyd Jones. There, Taylor took as his subject how much of a man was Jesus, and announced to the startled congregation it could not be claimed that he was a son of God. We have to stop short of saying unequivocally that Jesus is God. The Council of the Baptist Union refused to censure Taylor, claiming only that his views might cause alarm for some.
This kind of downgrade, which started in Spurgeon's time, led to many churches leaving the Baptist Union, and other organisations such as the United Reformed Church and the Methodist Church were similarly affected. Even some Anglican ministers and members left their larger group. The UK church scene is now more splintered and diverse than at any time in its history.
Many of these new and independent churches have arisen because of one particular phenomena, which we today call the charismatic movement. We have to say right from the start that this movement grew and multiplied because of the neglect of the Holy Spirit in mainstream churches. As with many excesses in the church, though they may be doctrinally dubious, they often reflect the church's own failings in a particular area.
The higher life movement we have already encountered often stressed supernatural gifts of the Holy Spirit alongside its holiness teaching. In September 1906, the pastor of the Azusa Street Mission in Los Angeles, one William J. Seymour, started to see some of these supernatural gifts reappearing in the church. He warned his people very seriously, "Don't go out of here talking about tongues. Go out of here talking about Jesus."
Sadly, few affected by the practices heeded his warning, and American Pentecostalism was born. It spread quickly in the USA, especially amongst the poor. However, it did not become a mainstream movement until the 1950s, where those who wanted to see supernatural workings of the Holy Spirit spread to mainstream churches. Some of the teachings of this movement, like that of its ancestor Montanism, are simply wrong. The claim, for example, that all should speak in tongues, whatever tongues were, is in direct contradiction to 1 Corinthians 12, and also denies the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Nothing else is required to make us a believer. Sadly, these differences became so noticeable that churches split over the issue. The charismatic movement had left us with three lasting legacies. The first is a rethinking of the work of the Holy Spirit, and he had been much neglected in evangelicalism. Preachers such as Lloyd Jones fully embrace this renewed emphasis without adopting some of the more extremes of the charismatic movement.
Secondly, the movement raised the profile of worship in churches. As we saw right at the beginning of these studies, singing was never of first importance in the early church, but it is sometimes claimed, by the time of the so-called charismatic renewal, singing in church had become moribund and lifeless. Charismatic music is far from being all good. Nevertheless, it has done a good job forcing evangelicals to think about what they sing and how they sing it.
The third change is also important. With the emphasis on spiritual gifts, the charismatic church modelled every member ministry, where each member of the church was involved in church life in some way.
Evangelicalism had been slowly slipping towards a subtle return to the priesthood, with the pastor taking on all the work in the church, having all the responsibilities, and even, for example, having to pay people to preach whilst he was away. But the excesses of the charismatic movement often came at the expense of Bible teaching, which ultimately led to its rejection in many mainstream churches. Out of these extremes grew so-called power evangelism. This movement used, and uses, dramatic unsubstantiated healings to bring people to Jesus, apparently ignoring that even Jesus said he could not perform such a feat. Proponents such as Benny Hinn, Morris Cerullo and Reinhard Bonnke are often seen on our television screens. In the last 20 years, an even more worrying trend has emerged, often called the prosperity gospel. Preachers promise health and wealth to those who will follow their cause.